So you heard a little different version of the David and Goliath story this morning. And wanted to bring to you a couple of different versions of that story because I think it's important to see it in a new light. I grew up listening to that story often in the congregation and the tradition that I was raised in, and for me, that story of David and Goliath was a particularly compelling one as a kid. First of all, it was about a young boy. It was about a young boy who had God on his side, fighting people who, at the time, I thought did not. And in my mind, the moral narrative was incredibly clear. David, an exemplar of morality and bravery, fights Goliath, who, in so many of the versions I had seen, I don't even know if I understood him to be a human person. I almost thought he was a monster, some sort of beast that was not a man. In fact, I looked all over the internet for this image, but I couldn't find it. One of the either storybooks or coloring books that I had used as a kid around this story had Goliath wearing this belt of bones. From all the people that he had defeated in battle, this evidence of his power and might, how scary he was. And I remember thinking about that story as a kid and thinking, this is a story about a little boy fighting for God against some sort of beast. It didn't matter if Goliath died, he should die. David should win. The moral narrative was clear. Now, in our summer series, we're looking at some TED Talks, which are, for those of you who don't know them, a series of talks from speakers in a variety of different settings that are in some ways some of the most popular content on the internet. Millions and millions of views. Some of them are like secular sermons of a kind. And in one that we watched together this week, it was Malcolm Gladwell, the author, looking at a new version of the David and Goliath story. He says in one of his recent books that we have to rethink this story and all underdog stories that we tell about ourselves because of what they imply. In this story, he says, David's not David, and Goliath is not Goliath. So we take the story of this beast who cannot be conquered, this huge man, 9 foot tall, who cannot be defeated in battle, and in reality, he says, how do people get to be 8, 9 feet tall? Normally, they end up living with what we would classify in terminology today as a disability. He says an individual like this likely would have been big and slow, achy joints, maybe having a condition that would cause problems with vision and speed and agility, versus a young man who is not just carrying with him a sling and rocks. He says, if you look back at ancient warfare, that slingers were the equivalent of snipers. That the ballistic studies people have done showed that using a rock and a sling in a competent way was like using a handgun. That people who used slings in battle could take down birds in mid-flight, hit targets at hundreds of yards away. So he says that in the narrative that we tell about underdogs, and we use that David and Goliath story to describe ourselves, you take a slow, lumbering, probably pain-filled body that is expecting hand-to-hand combat on a battlefield. The young boy with the equivalent of a gun walks up and ends the fight. Now, some people in our group on Wednesday thought that meant he cheated. Some people in the group said, no, you've got to use ingenuity and skills and play against the rules when you're fighting vast systems of injustice, and other people in between. No matter what you think about that story, I think it's interesting that that's the one we so commonly tell about ourselves. I heard the David and Goliath story mentioned last night on a program I was watching about farmers and a system of agriculture that they were trying to fight against. Just last night. It's everywhere, this narrative that we tell about ourselves as a moral narrative. And I think that an underdog story, like any tool we use, can be useful and dangerous. An underdog story about our morality can be compelling. It is, obviously, or we wouldn't tell this story for thousands and thousands of years comparing ourselves to young David. One member of our group said, this story and stories like it make a lot of sense for people who are oppressed, people in exile, people in prisons, people facing violence. The notion that you can, against all odds and risk, make a difference in the world. And yet I think it's a dangerous story if it's one of the only ones we have, because I don't know anyone who's ever told an underdog story in which they were not the underdog. I have never said, oh my God, I'm in the middle of this David and Goliath story. There is this really creative and risky, brave individual trying to take me on. I hope they win because I am Goliath. This story permeates our culture and our understanding of who we are in moral narratives. And the problem with an underdog story as one of the primary tools we use in our moral lives is if everybody uses it and everybody's David, then the world is full of Goliath. And Goliath must be eradicated for David to live. In this story, David is not just David. Goliath is not just Goliath. And I think we restrict our moral vision if we only allow ourselves the roles of underdog or oppressor, total saint or complete sinner. My nephew had an experience a few months ago that I think more accurately reflects the kind of complexities that we live in. He's 8. He was on the playground at his elementary school. He was sitting in the equivalent of like a tree house that was built, he and a couple of his friends. From across the way, he could see under one of those metal domes that you climb on, that a group of other kids in his grade had started picking on one of the kids in the class who has pretty significant social and emotional challenges. Kind of kid who is obviously struggling with a lot, but was a challenging presence in his classroom. My nephew watched as this group of kids began surrounding this boy. First, they were taunting him with words, and then the words got louder, and there were shouts, and then it started to get violent. One of the kids ran up and said, come on, there's a fight, and invited my nephew to be a part of it. And he looked over to see where the teachers were, and they were talking and weren't paying attention, didn't see what was happening. And he came home and he said he didn't know what to do. He said he was scared because he had been told in his class that if one person gets in trouble for breaking the rules, the whole class is going to get in trouble, that they share the responsibility. He was scared to say something because some of the people who were engaging in violence were his friends. He was afraid that he might be on the other end of that equation if he brought it up, that he would get in trouble for telling on students, or that he would get in trouble for not telling on the students, and he didn't know what to do, and he came home and his parents told him in their view what the right thing to do was, which was to make this known. And a few weeks later, there was this ceremony in his Boy Scout troop in which the young boy who was being bullied and hit is also a member of his Boy Scout troop, where my nephew got this award for moral bravery. And when my brother-in-law was telling this story around the table in front of our family, he said, and he kind of casually said this, and I'm going to talk in some kind of very general gender binaries here, so please know that. My brother-in-law said, well, now he knows what every young boy experiences growing up. You encounter some form of violence in word or act, and you're either the bully or the bullied, the silent or the teller, and probably all of those things by the time you get to middle school. And around the table, they looked at my father-in-law and he went, yeah. And to me, I said, yeah, that makes sense. And a couple members of our family were just shocked. I said, are you kidding me? Is that a reality? I said, yeah, it was for us. We saw that the roles that we play in life, in any moment, the span of our childhood or growing up or our adult lives, are never as simple as either being the bully or the bullied, David or Goliath, saint or sinner. In fact, we often exist somewhere in between. I've been every character in that story. The person using my words in violence against another child, and the child afraid I'm going to get hurt on a playground. The one who spoke up, and the one who was silent. And more often than not in my life, I'm either the teacher not noticing, or the kid who doesn't say anything. But I saw that my nephew's moral development, his growth, came not in being a complete saint or depraved sinner, but in the self-awareness that knew he was somewhere in between, and that made him grow. He had to wrestle with being somewhere in between. Now, our theology and our history affirm that you can build beloved community on earth. You can contribute to the beloved community on earth and not have to be one of the extremes. In fact, the Hebrew Bible and the Christian writings are full of antiheroes contributing to the beloved community when you wouldn't invite these people to dinner, let alone to do the work of God. The first two people in the Hebrew Scriptures can't follow the rules. By the time there are 4 humans, the text tells us, one of them has killed another one. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob pass on the birthrights to the people of Israel, and their children gain them often through deceit and lying to their fathers. Moses looks at God and said, "Are you kidding me? I'm a stutterer. How am I going to get up and stand before God's people and speak?" And before he does that, he's murdered an Egyptian and buried his body in the sand. Jonah says no to God before he's swallowed by a fish and vomited on the shore. King David, the young boy so virtuous, ends up being a ruler who uses his power and his lust after a woman to have her husband murdered in battle. And the Christian story culminates, the text tells us, in an unwed teenage girl living in occupied territory, giving birth to a man who becomes a homeless rabbi who dies on a cross. The culmination of power, the possibility in God's world in that history is one where you can contribute to the fulfillment of the world with whatever you have, however you are. It's unlikely that any of us is ever going to be Goliath or David as such. In fact, science teaches us that in a world in which nothing goes to waste and every atom in my body was the atom of something else beforehand, pieces of me have literally been other people. The atoms that make up my body have at some point been tyrannical lizards and graceful butterflies, oppressive dictators, and uprising peasants. And they will be again when I give my body back to the earth. In our tradition, we've understood God to rest in mystery, in the place of possibility and growth and creativity, and there is no possibility for full-out saints and full-out sinners. They are who they are. There's growth when we have the courage to acknowledge that likely in any conversation, in any marriage or relationship, in any classroom, in any city hall meeting, in some way we have the capability to be oppressor and oppressed. I think God becomes visible in a way to me when I realize that tension somewhere in between. I don't know, have you heard about the children's book White Flower? Okay, so this is a good one. This story comes out of a real story in the news in which in 2007 the Ku Klux Klan and some other neo-Nazi groups showed up in Knoxville, Tennessee for a rally. They'd invited people from out of state to have this big presence. They were going to do a rally in the middle of the streets, and they organized to get there. They're preparing for the rally, and a group called Mountain Justice had organized with another group called the Ku Klux Clowns. C-O-U-P, Ku Klux Clowns. When the rally began, hordes of clowns began showing up at the rally. And as the KKK and the neo-Nazis would get ready for their presentation and yell, "White power!" the clowns would say, "Yes, white flower!" And they would throw white flower, and they would giggle and laugh. And the people in the rally would say, "No, we said white power." They say, "Yes, we hear you, white flower!" And they would throw white flower everywhere, and they were dusted with all this white flour and laughing. And then one of the clowns would stand up and say, No, stop. We've gotten it wrong. They weren't saying white flower. They were saying wife power." And then dozens of clowns in bridal gowns would come rushing down the streets, holding signs shouting, wife power," which enraged the KKK even more. And a representative of the clowns would stop and say, "No, we've made another mistake. They were saying white flowers." Baskets of white flour started to appear. They would go and hand them and bow, covered in white flour and bridal gowns, giving a white flower to a neo-Nazi. And one of the reporters who talked about this event said that she had captured these moments where a couple of these individuals who were rallying, these neo-Nazis, she caught these little moments where they were smiling at the person handing them a flower, recognizing how ridiculous all of this was. More than one group of clowns. What I love about that story is that this was a group of individuals who met hate without becoming hateful. Who didn't need a David and Goliath story in which the big bad beast had to be defeated and destroyed in order for them to win. It was a group of people who knew that the beloved community on earth was possible in their moment. They could build it. They could build the beloved community on earth in a street corner filled with the KKK. And they could use clown makeup and bridal gowns and white flour and flowers to make it real. Our calling in this church is to build the beloved community on earth. Nothing less. The congregation exists so that we might develop our capacities to meet compassion, generosity, and service, a God of love, in such a way that we become the way that the beloved community is expressed. This is the whole reason why this place exists. And we can't do that if the only options we have to choose from in our moral stories are Goliath or David. We need a moral imagination that's willing to take on other characters in the story, to have the self-awareness and courage to realize that most of our life is spent somewhere in between. The creativity to use what we have to build beloved community on earth. Because that happens in hospital rooms with loved ones, and in city council meetings, and church sanctuaries, and family dinners, and grocery checkout lines in the post office, and street corners filled with neo-Nazis and clowns. The still small voice is available to us. We each have what we need to be builders of beloved community, whether it is the voice of an 8-year-old child on a playground, or a clown with clown makeup, or a boy with 5 smooth stones in a sling, or you. We hope that you have the moral imagination to find more characters than that, the moral imagination to realize you have more tools than you think you do, and the calling to be one of the builders of beloved community on earth with us. May it be so. Amen.